I'm Mike Connors, and this is How It Ticks. Let's pick up right where we left off with Nora Markwalder. How do the bigger criminal investigations happen, which are cross-border? What's the cooperation like?
Oh, well, that's always a bit difficult to say, but it depends on the case and also the countries. There are some countries where the cooperation is easier and others not. So usually there are rules to the cooperation. Also, if some foreign authorities wants information from someone from Switzerland, for instance, they have to go through the official channels, so it's like the international channels where you can cooperate. So usually I think that works sometimes better, sometimes less good, but it always depends a bit on the country you want information from.
Mm. Does Switzerland's role as a neutral country ever play into this? When you have maybe international court cases and you might have criminals in Switzerland because they're not allowed in Europe, is that ever used in law, the fact that it's a neutral country?
Not really, because there are quite strict rules when to cooperate and when not, and there are all like requirements like that. The offense has to be punishable in both countries, so that you are just helping out the other authorities if this is actually also a crime in your country. So to avoid some political, cases, that you help when people are only prosecuted for political reasons. So the neutrality actually is not really a big player, I would say, but I'm not really the biggest specialist on these international cooperation cases, because that's a very specific area and it always goes through the federal level if someone wants to cooperate internationally. Either you get information from a foreign authority, or the foreign authorities wanting to have information from the Swiss.
If there was a foreigner in Switzerland, say a tourist, and they murdered someone in Switzerland and were arrested, is their court case treated differently to a Swiss person doing that?
Not really. Actually, it's not supposed to, because independently of where you're coming from, what's important is that you've committed a crime on Swiss grounds, so on Swiss soil. That's the point of attachment for us, where the crime has been committed and where we are competent to prosecute. So basically, it's not really relevant whether or not you're a foreign citizen or you're a Swiss citizen. We have a lot of foreign citizens in Switzerland. I think it's almost 30% right now. So we have a lot of foreigners also in the criminal justice system. And they, at least in the ideal world, they should not be treated differently, at least not from the legal system. The only difference is a bit when you are arrested, then there is the question of whether or not you will get detained, like preventive detention during the case. And there, foreigners are a bit more likely to be detained, because there's one reason for this preventive detention is the risk of flight, being a fugitive. And that's obviously much higher for foreign nationals, because they can go back to their original countries of origin. And therefore, once you are back, like for instance, if you go back to Australia, Australia wouldn't trade or send you back for this proceeding. So you could go away and leave Switzerland, and then the Swiss justice system couldn't prosecute you anymore.
And if you were prosecuted as a foreigner, would it always be to a Swiss prison, or is there some sort of conversion where you could get sentenced to a prison in the country of origin of that person?
I think there's a possibility, because, the sentence is done by a Swiss court, of course, and the regular case is that you get your sentence in Switzerland. You have to, get the punishment and remain in prison in Switzerland. But I think it's a possibility that you can go back to your home country and be sentenced there or be in prison there. But I don't have the numbers in head, but I think it's quite rare.
Okay, because I imagine the Swiss taxpayer doesn't love the idea of paying for the rehabilitation of a foreigner who's committed a murder in Switzerland.
Yes, but the criminal justice system is a highly expensive thing anyways. So everyone who gets in there, and then of course also to prison. But what happens most of the time is also that once you are done with your prison sentence, you get expulsed from Switzerland, which is also a measure. So basically we quite like to export our problems once the sentence is finished, and then these people have to leave. So, and then it's not the problem of the taxpayer anymore. But yes, it is a lot of money. Our prisons are expensive, but that's quite inevitable, actually, because the criminal justice system is an expensive one.
Now I want to ask you about juveniles. My understanding is people under the age of 18 tried in a completely different system to people over the age of 18. How does that work, and how does it differ from adults?
It's really completely different, because with the juveniles, the idea behind is really that they are still, quite young. They can still be changed. They can still be educated. So the system, the juvenile justice system, is really based on education, on measures, on therapy, on reintegration. So you almost have no way of punishment. There are some minor punishments, but not really prison sentences under the age of 15, and then only just short ones. So it's really based on how to help and educate and better the juvenile rather than to punish him or her. And that's the main focus. And it's really, well, it's not particular in Switzerland, because like Germany and other countries have this focus as well. But what's really particular in Switzerland is also that it really stops with 18. It's like, you can't be, if you commit a murder, you should commit it while you're still under the age of 18, because once you really, the day you turn 18, you will get a really long prison sentence. But before, the maximum prison sentence is 4 years. So even if you commit the most heinous crime, it won't be possible to have a longer prison sentence than that. But there are some other like measures where you can also be sentenced to a therapeutic measure that can go on maybe for a bit longer, but it's a really short, like a sharp cut between 18 and older and below 18.
Are some of the outcomes for juveniles, but also adults, things like rehabilitation due to drugs, alcohol? You mentioned therapy as an option that people have in prison. Are there other things which get prescribed to people outside of prison, like therapy, like addiction treatment as well?
Yes, actually, they're both. They can be either done in prison or outside prison. So it's like depending on the measure that you get. If you get the a prison sentence, usually an unconditional one, an unsuspended one, then you are in prison and you usually have the therapy in prison. But some and a lot of people, they just get suspended sentences and they get the measure right next to the sentence. So they actually have to go maybe see a doctor or like a drug addiction therapy. This is also something that you can do while you're still like roaming around freely.
Do you have access to statistics in terms of crime rates over the last, say, 10, 20 years? Are they generally going up or down in Switzerland?
Well, it depends a bit, but in general, it's more of a downward trend for a lot of offenses. In the last couple years, we had some upward trends again, but really, as a general trend, it was more going down. But it was also these overall crime trends, they're very much influenced by mass offenses such as burglary and theft. So if you look at the different offenses specifically, you can see that some, especially with the juveniles now, that the violent crimes are getting a bit higher again. So they are increasing. But for homicides, for instance, we have had quite a drastic decrease in the last 30 years. So they have declined quite significantly, at least homicides against men. From men to men, intimate partner homicides are quite stable throughout the years and even decades. Yeah.
I mean, it's impressive. It's also mind-boggling because it seems like, especially in many other places in Europe, crime is going ballistic, or at least that's the impression that I get when you read news about France and Germany. Why is it so stable? Do you think it's a stable economy and everybody has their needs met and therefore feels less likely to commit a crime?
It certainly has to do with wealth, with maybe better social services, education, etc. But I'm not quite so sure whether other countries have had some really high
Mm.
increases, because at least I've done comparative work on homicide, and the trends in homicide were the same for the surrounding countries. We've done a comparative work, and we've seen that in the Netherlands, in Sweden, in Finland, all these countries, the homicide rates were decreasing as well. So I'm not quite sure whether I think that the overall general trend has been in the last 30 years that the crime has declined, but it was an overall trend. It was in the US and it was in Europe and it was also in Australia, I think, but maybe not in Africa and Latin America,
Mm.
but at least in Western European countries and in the US and Canada as well. So maybe now it's always a bit fluctuating and some offenses increase, some not. But overall, I don't think it's really been worse than it's been before.
Okay, that's good to know.
Mm.
Interesting. Do you deal with organized crime very much? Have you seen, is there a lot of organized crime in the courtroom in Switzerland?
Very few. So this is a very rare constellation because, well, some argue and say, well, we don't get them
Hmm.
because they're too smart or we don't catch the organized crime. But it's also very difficult to do research on it. There are not really good numbers or estimates about the activity of, for instance, organized crime groups like the mafia. And there are different organized crime groups. You know, some always think of mafia structures or like Italian mafia. Some have other mafias in mind, but there are also some like motorcycle gangs and stuff like that. So it's quite diverse and it's not a common really definition. The criminal code has a definition of organized crime, but it's quite difficult to apply. And I'm sure there are activities, but I can't really tell you, and we don't really have numbers about how big these activities are.
Mm. What about drug-related crimes? Are they changing? I mean, I guess it. I know that the '90s there was a heroin epidemic in Zurich. How has that changed in the last 30 years?
Yeah, that has quite changed because you're right. In the 90s, there was this open drug scene in Switzerland in general, in Zurich, and this open drug consumption area that was right next or behind the train station, and it was everyone. It attracted drug addicts from all over Switzerland. It was a mess, and in the 90s, they decided to close this area down and that had made really disappear like this attraction of Zurich for these drug addicts. And what was also what they did, the authorities, it's not only close the area down, but also try to help these people with substitution, like methadone programs, drug substitution programs, other help. So they really tried to tackle the problem by the root, and that had really at least had an impact on various crime or drug related crimes, such as also thefts, robberies, but also homicides related to crime, to drug addiction or drug trading. They have gone down as well. So it's really had a positive impact on crime rates that they have tried to tackle this problem by the roots.
It seems once again that principle of rehabilitation. Although it must be a difficult thing to digest if you are the family member of someone who's been murdered and the treatment is rehabilitation when you'd probably just want punishment. That must be something which doesn't sit right with some relatives of victims.
Sure. And in the case of like these really serious crimes, like the vengeance or retribution aspect of the punishment is also there because of the long prison sentence. So it's clear that they have to go to prison and they have to sit there and wait until the time is over, you know. So what is more maybe a bit problematic from the victim side is when you see that someone who has maybe committed an assault, maybe some serious forms of assault, just gets like a monetary penalty, you know. That's more difficult to understand from the victim point because finally, and then a suspended sentence. So basically, people don't even have to pay something or go to prison. It's just suspended. That's something that in the population and from the victim side is sometimes not very well perceived, and also leads to a lot of discussion about to the leniency of the system and that we were too lenient, that we're not tough on crime, and that it's really not also disrespectful towards the victims, that the offenders basically walk free. So this is more like the problem there. That's also these suspended sentences that get applied quite a lot.
Is the way that people are prosecuted, is that there because of a public vote? what role does the public have in this in terms of deciding how people are prosecuted?
Yeah, it's actually quite a good question, because there is the public plays a role, especially when it comes to the sentence, the possibility of of length of sentence. And there's a lot of political initiatives that try to amend and change the criminal code. And that's why we have a lot of things in our criminal code that are because of a popular vote. So for instance, like the possibility of lifelong, it's not a lifelong imprisonment, it's not punishment, it's just like this imprisonment after the punishment if you are dangerous. So this is an initiative that happened in Switzerland, or some other initiatives. For instance, the expulsion of foreigners was also something that was required by a popular vote, so that criminal foreigners get expulsed from Switzerland. So you have a lot of these things that are in the criminal code. Also, the interdiction or the prohibition of convicted sexual offenders to work with children. So if you've been convicted of a sexual offense against children, then you're not allowed to work with children anymore. Sounds logical, but
Yeah.
that's something that has been exactly introduced by a popular vote.
Mm.
So there is an exchange, and that's why it's also like a corrective. If you have maybe an excess or things that the population doesn't understand, then there is a chance that it goes to a popular vote.
I mean, at least it's progressive in the sense that conversations can be had. I mean, I can imagine in a lot of countries, at least very conservative ones, the idea of talking about whether to allow previously charged sex offenders to work with children again would be a conversation you couldn't even have. So it sounds, at least in that sense, it's progressive enough to have these conversations.
Yes, and it's also actually quite a good thing to have these conversations. It's obviously you always get a majority that says, yeah, we have to punish a bit more, we have to do this more. So the tendency is clear, is going to be more restrictive, be more punitive. But I think it's good for the system to have this conversation, that also the population, or at least the ones that are allowed to vote, which is, as I've mentioned before, with 30% of foreign nationals, it's not really all of the population, but at least the ones that get to vote can have this conversation about the usefulness of higher sentences, or maybe also the possibility of doing something else. So the conversation as such is actually a good thing. But unfortunately, it's often a conversation about how can we make the system harsher and punish more, because that's always a bit easier from a political point of view to defend this type of position.
From your view, what would you like to see changed?
Well, where shall I start? No, actually, I think there are some things that could be changed. I especially am critical in regard to the summary penalty order system, because I think it's getting applied a bit too extensively, although I'm well aware that these are economic restraints as well. The criminal justice system is overburdened. We have a lot of cases that come in and have to be treated, but the summary penalty order procedure is a bit critical, because there is no exchange with the defendant, there is no explanation of what happened, and people get convicted although they don't have an idea what is going on. And that's not the sense of a conviction either. You have to know what you've done wrong, you have to understand what this procedure is for and what you've done. And I would like to see a bit more of these summary penalty order procedures being done with an exchange with the defendant, with a hearing, maybe with an explanation also what's going on, in order to make it more efficient. But yeah, I'm well aware that all the prosecutors and that are doing these types of procedures, they're like, we don't have it must be fast and efficient. And of course, that's something that's always a bit of a problem in the criminal justice system. Not enough time, not enough money.
And is it like it's depicted in films where you have these big fancy law firms who are very, very expensive, and then you also have the underpaid, overworked lawyers working for the state, and often the small guy gets assigned the state worker and then the big guy gets the big expensive lawyer?
Actually, not that much, because at least from my time as a defense attorney, we had an association that still exists, where they get called, and these when a case happens where you need like a public defender. But these were like regular lawyers. They were very well. It depended a bit what your luck was, but there were some very, very good experienced defense attorneys that usually worked for also big firms that were also doing this work. So it was more like it's well seen to do that. So it's actually not that you have this caseworker that has like 100 other cases and just has like 10 hours for you. The state also pays you per hour. So basically, you can do all the necessary work. You can't do excessively whatever you want, but usually you can do your job. You can, do all the things necessary and you get paid by the hour. There are also some maybe not experienced ones, but you can also have some really good defense attorneys. But on the other hand, money is also, of course, an issue. If you are rich, then you can, of course, choose also which lawyer you want to work with. Yeah.
Mm. Are there any current debates or controversial issues in Swiss criminal law which you think might change in the next 2, 3, 4 years?
Well, there's a controversial debate or this on the juveniles, because right now there is no possibility to lock up a juvenile longer than just these short periods of time. They have to be released. And there are some very rare cases of highly dangerous juveniles, some of them that have committed an homicide and where you know that they should not be released anymore. So this is something that is debated right now, whether or not there should be a possibility of also locking up indefinitely or eternally these types of juveniles. This is something that is right now going on. And something that should be discussed but hasn't been much discussed is the whole digitalization of the criminal justice system, especially the procedural law. It's not very digital yet, with all the data involved, etc. It's been made for like physical evidence and physical steps, etc. And this is a big debate that's going to come up, is how to make our procedural code more fit for the digital era, I think.
Mm. Speaking of digital era, how much is large language models going to revolutionize being a lawyer?
Well, a couple of months ago, I would have said, yeah, maybe not that much, but I'm not so sure anymore because some of my colleagues have also tried, to do some legal work, also some law, like lawyers' work, and these models start to become increasingly good. The problem is still that most of the literature is behind a paywall, so they don't have access to it. And the Swiss market is quite a small one, so you don't have a lot of training data yet. But as soon as you have it, and some of the bigger law firms, they already have some smart systems internally for their documents and files. As soon as you this gets more in publicly accessible, then it'll revolutionize, I think, the whole profession as well. What's still very important, though, if you are working as a lawyer, especially as a criminal defense attorney, is the personal contact with the defendant, also the trust. That's something also very important, and tactical questions. And that's something that probably large language models can't really help you with yet, because it's not written down somewhere. It's dependent on your experience and on the special case and maybe on the constellation that you find. And that's something that these large language models can't really replace. But for all knowledge-based and legal knowledge-based areas, I think they'll change the game.
I mean, lawyers are the ones famously in university who have just the world's largest stack of textbooks they have to go through and memorize. And gee, if all they get
Exactly.
if they get a laptop instead, my God, what a difference it must be.
Exactly. I think that will change also the way we have to educate lawyers. Learning by heart is not going to be a top priority anymore.
And God, that's got to be a good thing, right? That can't be the favorite part of the job.
It's not, but on the other hand, it's good to have an overview, and have it present. You can't just look everything up. And if you have a client in front of you and they ask a question and then you say, "Oh, wait, I have to look it up," then it's not really a good thing. So that's also, you have to have a good overview on all the different problems, and that means learning by heart was part of your education, basically.
Mm. So, coming to the end of the conversation, I just wanted to ask you, what are you working on at the moment, which excites you?
Well, my homicide research basically, but that's more like the criminological side, but it's also a legal side because right now I'm preparing a paper on how femicides, the killing of women, are getting sentenced, because we have a database on all homicide cases and we filtered out the femicide cases. And right now I'm looking at that and see whether or not they get sentenced, like the offenders get sentenced with higher prison sentences or lower. So that's something I'm quite interested in. And otherwise, yeah, I have too many projects and too little time. So I basically trying to fit everything in during the semester where I have also to teach. But this is like one area that I'm really excited about.
On that femicide thing, do you think the punishment for the killing of women would increase in the recent times with this Me Too movement, with the feminist movement, and the more conscious move towards female rights? Is that also, do you think, linked to more penalties of murder of women?
Well, that's what I'm trying to find out
Interesting.
then. But yes, because one hypothesis could be that this public awareness also raises awareness for maybe the seriousness of these offenses. But I don't think so, because at the end, it's always a judge and the court who is looking at a lot of individual aspects of the offender, but also of the offense or the circumstances, etc. And I'm not quite sure whether these media coverage now have an influence so much on the individual judges who actually have to
Mhm.
judge the case. My hypothesis is that I won't find any kind of increase in these punishments over the last couple of years, but we'll have a look at it.
Interesting. Is there anything else that I didn't ask you about that is worth mentioning?
No, because you've probably managed to ask me almost all areas of criminal law and criminology in 1 hour. That's quite
And you
quite
answered
impressive.
without taking a break. I'm very impressed.
Well, I'm trying to.
Well, Nora, this has been a very interesting conversation for me. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Thanks for listening. If you did enjoy the episode and you want to support me, it would mean a lot if you could rate the episode and follow the podcast on your favorite platform. It really helps the show grow and reach more people. I'll see you in the next episode.